Construction champions, it's your host, Ron Nussbaum, and we're here for another amazing episode of Construction Champions Podcast, where we're burning the house down twice a week. By now, you know it's every Monday and every Thursday morning. You're going to get a new fire episode with me, Ron Nussbaum, and as always, an amazing guest. Because we're not just burning that house down because it was a bad project. That house we're burning down is your business, and we're rebuilding it. It's your personal life, and we're rebuilding it. Whatever that elephant in the room for you is, whatever's keeping you from being a champion, that's what we're burning down, and we're fixing it. And today, I'm super excited for our guest, Bryan. It is great to have you on the show today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome, man. Why don't you take some time, tell the construction champions out there a little bit about yourself and what got you here to today?
Yeah, like a lot of people, I fell into the industry back in 1999, bought a house, started renovating it. I went to university for something completely unrelated to construction and just kind of fell into it. Was always played sports, so I was kind of dexterous. I was kind of good at doing the carpentry thing, and so decided to kind of, follow that as a career path. And a few years in, started my own business. Spent about 8 years in the school of hard knocks, learning all the mistakes, pre-YouTube, pre-podcast, pre-Instagram, pre-Facebook, pre-everything. And, tail end of that sort of portion of time, I worked for a whole bunch of different larger scale residential remodeling and custom home building companies. I'm a Red Seal certified carpenter. I'm from Canada. If you hear the accent today, when I say out or about, you'll know I'm from Canada. And we have our Red Seal certified carpentry ticket up here. So that's what I went through and worked as a lead, worked as a superintendent, a project manager, operations manager, general manager. And of course, I own my own business as well. And 2018, I, really had no reason to kind of pivot away from what I was doing. But I think I've always really enjoyed a challenge and, pivot into coaching. I'm clearly not the only coach, for construction companies out there, but was watching a handful of people and thought with the level of experience I had, and of course, going through all of the mistakes I went through, in the 2000s, figured there was a lot that I could offer in terms of helping this industry. And yeah, we're 5.5 years in or so. And it's been a very fun ride and, been doing one-on-one coaching and spent the past 16 months also building project management software as well that we're just about to release to the market in conjunction with our coaching. So yeah, that's kind of a 2-minute, recap of
Awesome,
25
man.
years.
Awesome. I love, yeah. You get,
Yeah.
Hey, real quickly, can you just break down the last 25 years of your life in about 2 minutes for me?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but you brought up an interesting, man, it was not that long ago when podcasts and YouTube and stuff, it just didn't exist. Everybody was kind of out there on their own. It's
Yeah.
really amazing to think about that. Like it just wasn't that long ago.
What's interesting about it too is like, so anybody listening to this that's like, let's say born in the 2000s or like even late 90s or something, like your world, the way you've grown up is so different, right? By the time you're born in 95, by the time you're 10 years old, Facebook existed, YouTube was a year away. Like these things are, commonplace, but for someone like myself, like it's this, I didn't grow up with any of this stuff, it was in my like late 20s that this stuff
Yeah.
all started to populate in our lives. So I look at my nieces and nephews and it's like their world is so different. And so it's such a great time to be, I mean, there's good and bad of social media, obviously, and all of this stuff, but I think it's such a great time to be alive and there's the resource around, for everybody, podcasts and just, all the sort of community sharing of information that happens that didn't exist before. It was like you had to go read a book or make the mistake and learn it the hard way. That was kind of like your, school of hard knocks, basically.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's amazing. And now we get the opportunity to come together, have a conversation here, and unless they delete the internet, this will live on forever. Like 5 years
That's right.
from now, this could completely change somebody's life. And to me, that's super exciting. It's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I do this.
Yeah.
But let's dive in there, man. I'm going to ask the $1,000,000 question, and that is, what makes a construction champion?
Yeah, I mean, a loaded question for sure. Lots of different lenses as to who we're talking about, but let's talk about a construction business owner and what kind of makes a champion in our industry here. And I think there's obviously a lot of advice that anybody will give you, be it a coach or someone that's actually running a construction business still and has gone through all of the experiences. On a very high level, I think success in business comes down to really being vulnerable and humble and understanding that you're not expected to know everything. I think this translates through all the time I spent as a project manager working on like multi-million dollar projects or $25,000 projects, doesn't really matter, but like really understanding where your client's at and understanding who you need to be and show up for that person in that
Mm.
way. And so there's I had this conversation on a podcast last week where we were talking about the difference between EQ and IQ and which one's more important. Like, would I rather be smarter, but, a jerk? Or would I rather be empathetic with the caveat of being, you don't have to be apologetic about it, but you can be empathetic with a client. And then, I don't know, be stupider for lack of a better expression. And honestly, I come back to it and I say, like, so many of the problems I see are from people not being able to be vulnerable, not being able to really empathize with clients and understand exactly what they're feeling, what they're going through at any given point in, their journey. Because for us as builders, you have anywhere from, let's say, 2 to 12 projects going on at the same time, depending on the size of the company, scale of your operations, and all of that. But to your client, all they see is their own project. And so much of the challenge, I think, in running a successful business comes down to communication, because I can really trace back every single problem back to a communication error. And so this is where I talk about being vulnerable and, really looking for the ability to grow. And that's kind of what I think makes you a champion. There's another thing that it just came up on a client call right before this podcast, which is, I always say that we're going to make mistakes, right? So this is part of the being vulnerable and, seeking growth and all of that. How you come back from those mistakes is, it says so much about, your integrity and how you operate as a business. And it's okay that you're wrong sometimes because you're human, but how do you respond to that is really what I think defines. It really doesn't matter, honestly, what industry we're talking about, but ultimately, like, as a business owner, the way that you handle yourself when the cards are down or the chips are down, that says more about you being a champion than anything.
Absolutely, man. I have a soft spot in me about communication because that's one of the hurdles uh I faced
Hmm.
during my time in residential construction, and it's why I do what I do now.
Hmm.
But I think you just, like, we tossed it up and you just hit a grand slam when you're talking about having the ability to admit when you're wrong and also
Hmm.
just being humbled enough to say you don't know. I think
Yeah,
all too often in construction, like, we think we have to know everything and have the answer for everything, and like
yeah,
that's the shit that gets us in trouble.
totally. Yeah. Like, the thing about it is you don't need to know everything, but what you need to do is to be able to get the answer, and you need to be able to define the time frame in which you're going to get that answer, and then you got to do what you said you're going to do. And it's not very complicated, when it comes to communication. But far too often what I have seen, especially in this project management lens, is that I have this like little image. And so if, when you're thinking about this right now, just try to visualize a really big box and then beside it, a very small box. We spend most of our time in the very big box and not so much time in the small box. The one on the left, the big box, is the non-client facing box. The one on the right is the client facing box. And the challenge is exactly this. I need to have all the answers before I go to the client about this problem that we've encountered, when quite often, if you actually just take a different approach and involve them in the conversation, but guide that conversation, again, you don't need to know everything, but you need to be able to guide through to a resolution. You actually sometimes come out with a much better outcome, because sometimes the outcome that you might work all this time on isn't actually what your client wants. So, simple example, I had a project years ago. We had 4 bathrooms and a laundry room and a kitchen. So there was a whole bunch of areas where tiles were going in. It was like a new house. And one of the bathrooms, they tile showed up, right size, right material, wrong color. And it got installed, and the project manager knew about this and was like working feverishly to find a resolution. I said, the clients, now I know the clients are living around the corner. I said, did you tell the clients yet? Did you bring them into the loop on this? Because the worst thing that can happen is that they walk in and see that, and then they're going to lose trust in your ability, in us as a company. And so I want you to, like, step out of this meeting, give them a call, just let them know what's happened, tell them the steps that you're taking, tell them when you'll be back to them, and then come back to the meeting. Because you just never want your client to kind of see this. So again, it's like you're going to make mistakes. There's nothing macho or there's no pride about like having to like solve everything in advance and be perfect because all of that's a fallacy. It doesn't exist, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, it's such a critical thing for sure when we talk about like having to have all those answers and it couldn't be further from the truth, really.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to the controlling emotions. Like, no
Yeah.
matter what's happening,
Hmm.
you have to understand, like, these are emotions that people feel, like, when you're dealing with upset customers or an
Hmm.
escalated situation, whether it's a customer, an employee, or anybody, like,
Yeah.
these are as the leader, we have to understand these are emotions they're feeling. We have to
Yeah.
work through those. We have to get to the root cause of all this, and we just can't come in and just completely throw their emotions out the window. That's how you get in
Yeah.
trouble really, really quick.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Without question. Yeah. I've always said like drop your emotional baggage at the door, go in and be the person you need to be for that client or that team member, internal team member at that moment in time. Right. And it's really easy to like forget that or like to nod your head right now as you're hearing this, thinking, yeah, 100%. Yeah, I get that. I get that. But then we're all fallible to this at a certain point, right? There's clients that piss us off. It happens. There's, team members that are like, may piss us off from time to time, sort of thing. And it's really easy to kind of like let that get in the way of being who we need to be for that individual at that moment.
well, I think it's really we take stuff too personal. Like it's not
Yeah.
personal. Like
Yeah.
it's literally
Oh, yeah.
something that's happening on this project. This is an emotional reaction they're happening, and
Yeah.
then we take it like it's a direct attack on
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And when we talk about burning the house down, that's what ends up happening. Because then, like
Yeah.
you come into the situation that's already escalated, then next thing you throw gasoline on it because you didn't leave
Yeah.
your emotional crap in the truck. You
Yeah.
brought it in there with you.
Yeah. In life in general, regardless of construction or business or anything, the thing I always tell people is like, and this just came with age because I was not as mild mannered as I am, I'd say these days, but my wife could attest to that. But the thing about it is you always have to think about the outcome that you're looking to achieve. So, good example of this is like we've all had one of those like tepid email exchanges with a client or one of those ones where you like write an email and then if you looked at it 2 hours later or the next morning you're like, "Yeah, no, there's no way I'm sending this." That sort of reality of like thinking through every problem and asking yourself what's the reaction that I want, because I've gotten to a place in my life where like I could care less about being right or wrong. I mean, I coach full time, this is what I do. I'm not right 100% of the time. There's times we're driving down a discussion and I'm not seeing it the same way as, a business owner. And we might agree to disagree on something. I'm reflecting my opinion and all that. That's fine. What's most important is the outcome, and the outcome for them is their success, right? To make sure that they're getting the ability to think through problems and make the right decisions. And so every time you're faced with a situation with an upset client, upset team member, whomever it is, like really just think about the outcome that you want and ask yourself the question, if I do this, will I get towards that result? If I'm playing pool, 9 ball or 8 ball or whatever, where am I leaving the cue ball so I get the next ball? Try to think of it that way.
Yeah, and that comes back to what you were originally saying when you said you have to control these conversations.
Yeah,
Like that's what being a leader is. It's being the business owner
that's right.
is you're willing to have the thought process to understand this is where I'm trying to go. I need to navigate this there. I
Hmm.
need to get it's just like for anybody that's ever done sales, like you're trying to get somebody where they're
Yeah.
going, where you want them, and that's to say yes. It's
Hmm.
the same thing being a leader.
Yeah.
Is you're getting people to that point and getting them to buy in on what your vision is 3, 4 steps down the road. You just can't take them there immediately. You need to
Yeah.
walk them through 1, 2, 3, and 4 to get them there.
Yeah. And it's really hard because, we always say like being at the top is very lonely. And, my example of this is like I remember being a carpenter and watching lead carpenters I was working with and thinking, gosh, these guys are really like disorganized and like we don't have the material when we need it and all this sort of thing. And then, whatever, few months later, a year later or something, I became a lead carpenter. And in my first 3 weeks of doing it, I was failing miserably at organizing and controlling everything, is because it's hard once you're in that, like once you're in that seat, you really get an understanding of what it feels like. And it's the same for like literally every single business owner that I've, encountered in my program as well as one-on-one. We all have a component of this, right? Where it's like you're making decisions, especially when it's the vision or the direction of a company, you're making all these decisions. And oftentimes you don't really have anybody to bounce that off of and to say, hey, what do you think? Like, what's your experience with this? Or, you don't really know and you're kind of just making choices. And I remember being a carpenter or being a lead in a super, and you're making decisions, especially in the remodeling or renovating world where like, things aren't, like the two-dimensional drawing does not turn out to be the three-dimensional reality like it does oftentimes in custom home building.
Hmm.
So you have to make decisions and then you have to live with those decisions. So and there's a level of confidence that you build over years, but initially it's really hard. Same thing happens as a business owner, right? So that confidence grows in years. You talk to somebody that's been doing it for 20 or 30 years, there's just a confidence there because it's just the years of experience that they've gone through, and they kind of get a sense of how they're going to get their outcomes and all of that. But yeah, it's the confidence piece. It's lonely at the top. Leading is really, really hard. It's a lot easier to manage. Everyone, listening to this, I'm sure, can nod their head and agree with that. If you've been in a leadership position, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, you just spend a lot of time alone, and then you spend a lot of time walking around alone. What the processing stuff,
That's
going
right.
through, figuring out
That's
how
right.
do you create these outcomes? How do you get the sale happens with you first,
Hmm.
and you have to get yourself over the hump, and then you have to go figure out how you can get somebody else over it. And
Yeah.
like you said, it's a lonely word to be in sometimes.
Yeah. And one of the hardest parts too is exactly just riffing off of what you just said about like how do you actually then get other people to help get, towards that outcome. So we take the example of a construction business where say you're doing remodeling or custom home building, and you likely have superintendents and project managers and potentially, depending on the scale of your operations, an operation manager, general manager, et cetera, pre-construction coordinators, et cetera. So, you typically, business owner is still very involved in the sales process, which I firmly believe in. I do believe even for the companies that are doing 10 plus million in residential construction, I encourage those business owners to stay in that seat. Now, they don't do a lot of the heavy lifting of the sales, but they are the face of the brand, right? And they generally speaking can always represent the company in the best light. I'm sure there's going to be differing opinions on that. That's just my own personal opinion. But how do you ensure that what you sell as the brand owner in that sales and slash pre-construction process becomes the reality during construction or the actual execution? And that's where we always talk about a bit of brand dilution. So the solution here is that leadership, is that mentorship, right? Whether you're doing it yourself or you are putting in practice a mentorship program within your organization, which I know some people are listening to this are like, I'm doing so much already. How could I possibly do this? But this is how good companies become great and how they grow, is that, you can't do it alone, and you have to like spend the time and invest in the people that are in your company. Not everyone's going to be an A player. I get it, but you have to find those people and you have to invest in them because they're the ones that can actually like execute those projects without that brand dilution that, we never want to feel.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about doing just does not happen enough in construction because you want to grow,
Hmm.
you want to have the ability to put other people in leadership roles and their careers to grow, but we're not willing to take the time on the front end to start to take the people that say they want that, to give them a taste of it, to show them what exactly that looks like,
Yeah.
how we want to do it here, like this is how we do it here, and have that narrative. And then next thing, we just put somebody in a role, they run the freaking truck into the wall and it's a disaster. And we
Hmm.
wonder why, when at the end of the day, you just got to go look in the mirror on that one. Like,
100% extreme ownership, right? I think the other part about, what we're talking about right at the top of the pod is like, being vulnerable and, just understanding that like you have a hand in all the outcomes that present themselves in your business, right? So if you have a project manager who like, you know, just really runs the truck into the wall basically, or runs a project into the ground, or really screws up communication and all of that, it's easy to point fingers and blame them. But realistically, you need to be looking in the mirror and ask yourself the question of like, Do I have a best practice communications document? Do I do a workshop with everybody that comes in, especially a project manager who's managing, doesn't matter how big the project is, but especially in like when you start to get into the hundreds of thousands and into the millions, like those buyers, they're different people than people you're building a deck for in a lot of senses, right? And the expectation level is a lot higher. And we often just hire like project managers who aren't project managers. So again, do I look in the mirror and say like, did I actually explain and coach and mentor somebody into like how we're going to communicate, how we're going to deliver bad news? The tiles are the wrong ones on the wall. How do you actually do that? When do you do that? And what are the next steps, sort of thing? Like these are all the pieces that I think a lot of us fall into the trap. And I see it on an ongoing basis where we hire somebody in a specific job title, like superintendent or project manager, and we just make that assumption that they're going to be able to run with the project. And, we always like to say that like your job of like mentorship starts when you're onboarding somebody and it never stops. And I think a lot of business owners fall into the trap of I've hired somebody, I can stop putting energy there, put them into the deep end, sink or swim. I've worked for so many people that are like that. They've literally said that to me. And I've been working for them at the time. And of course, I'm not going to turn around and say, hey, like, let me go get a mirror and put it in front of you. Cause that's just, not a polite thing to do, of course. But that's the reality, like the sink or swim thing, throwing people into the deep end doesn't really work. And just as a sidebar, like any of you that have organizational charts or talk in terms of titles, like it's what I really hate titles because I think we put a label on something like project manager and we just assume a certain capability, which doesn't really exist. I mean, they're important, of course, to be able to categorize a job description and all of that, but like thinking more into that of like, what am I going to do to help that person succeed and actually reach the result statement?
100%, man. I mean, it's all so I think in the construction industry, what happens all too often is you have a lot of achievers and go-getters that aren't necessarily leaders. And
Hmm.
how we promote within construction is typically, well, who's kicking ass as a foreman or who's kicking. And sometimes I'm 100% guilty of this. It's promoting somebody to a role they don't even want just because they were kicking ass, and
Right.
then coming to find out, if I would have had a conversation with them, they just wanted to go run a job. They didn't want to be in
Right.
charge of other foremen. They
Yeah. Yeah.
didn't want
Yeah.
to be a superintendent. They just wanted to be the best foreman they possibly could. But we
Yeah.
look at it as like, who's the best performer? We just automatically think, well, that person's going to then be the best performer here. And then you get people that are just performing to get to that role. And then when
Yeah.
they get there, it's not, it comes back to everything you talked about, where you put these almost stop gaps in the training process as you
Hmm.
bring people up through your company, to filter them out and make sure that they are the right people to carry that brand message on to represent the company going forward.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that, I do with clients that I work with and I encourage everyone to consider is creating a career roadmap. And so the career roadmap is basically whatever format you take it in, it can be a Google Sheets, Google Docs, whatever. Doesn't matter how you're doing it. But the idea is get really super clear about outcomes of every position in your company and then the specific job functions that build towards those outcomes. Most job descriptions are just lists of tasks, but really what you really need some clarity on is like what are some outcomes that a project manager has, a superintendent has. So these are things that both add to the stakeholders of within your own company, but as well outside of your company, meaning like your clients and professional partners and all of that. And that's a whole other big topic. But the career roadmap is just basically putting those all side by side and being able to actually show somebody what does the path look like. If you're coming in as a carpenter, eventually, like a lot of project managers, I'd say that maybe this is a really bad generalization. It's just from my own experience, but a lot of project managers were carpenters at one point, and it's kind of how we tend to grow into that role, unless you go like the formal education route, which is a whole different thing. That's more like the engineering side of things. But generally speaking, if I'm a carpenter and I want to become a PM, because everyone wants to be a supervisor today with no experience, of course, right? They want to be on the top of the mountain without climbing it. Another story or another conversation altogether. But, how do you show people what they're going to need to do? What are the steps that they're going to need to take? And it's not going to happen overnight. Like, it's going to take a couple years in this position and a couple years in this position. Like, I wasn't a good project manager when I ran my own business in the 2000s, right? It took me time to figure out how to do it because I was also learning the trade at the same time. So, that's kind of something that I think is really crucial for companies. Majority of companies do not have this. Majority of companies even struggle to have proper like position agreements where they do focus on things like a result statement and outcomes, and then some clarity on the tactical things that I'm doing to reach those outcomes without the focus on the outcomes. So, but that's something that's just for everybody listening here. If it's interesting to you, like Google it, start thinking about it, putting your job description side by side and trying to show how the football passes between the positions is kind of how I describe it, and I think it's a very helpful thing for like building some culture and some like through that mentorship and really keeping, A players moving in your company.
Awesome, man. I love it. I love everything you talked about today. So for all the construction champions out there listening, if they wanted to connect with you, follow you, or talk to you, where should they go?
Yeah, easiest way is our website, constructionconsulting.co. And we're active, very active on Instagram and LinkedIn as well. So you can search those handles and you'll find us on those platforms as well.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you for taking the time and being on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, construction champions, another episode in the bag where we talked about one of my favorite things is having the ability to just be humble and admit when you're wrong. I think this is a trait that we all have in us, but we feel forced. It might even be kind of the wrong language to use there around this, but when we think about it, at heart, we're fixers. We want to make stuff right. And we want to, when stuff goes wrong, we still want to figure it out. And we don't want to have to talk about it. We just want to show the end result about how bad it was and now how good it is. We don't have to do that when we're dealing with people. Like we can say, I don't have the answer right now. Because think about it, when you open up a wall and something's wrong in there, you don't have the answer immediately. You think about it a little bit. You're honest with yourself that, you got to process some of this. You might be honest with some of your guys around, but how come every time a customer asks a question or somebody comes in there and we're like, no, this is fine, we got it, this is going to be this way, this is all good, don't worry. We don't just say, hey, I might need a minute to figure out exactly what this looks like it's not hard. It's just the industry kind of makes it hard, especially for us that have been around it for a while, where that's just kind of the norm. I mean, that's what Construction Champions podcast is about, is disrupting that norm, changing the mindset around the construction industry, making it okay to say, hey, I might not have the answer to that, but I can figure it out and I will get back to you, and then get back to them. That right there is a construction champion. That right there changes the narrative around the industry and what that customer might even think about the entire construction industry. So make sure you go out, you check out all of our great sponsors. And until next time, be the champion you were meant to be.
Introducing BuilderComms, the construction communication software that's changing the game. Say goodbye to communication challenges and hello to effortless communication. With BuilderComms, you can communicate with clients, share pictures, videos, and documents, and keep clients informed about the progress of their projects. Get real-time updates, prevent miscommunications and delays, and ensure successful projects. Don't let bad communication ruin your construction projects. Try BuilderComms today. Visit us at buildercomms.com.